I got it.
Oh, you got it.
I don't want to say an introduction. This isn't our first rodeo.
No. It sucks.
Oh yeah, should we? I think just pull that off, and I think we just have to turn it on. If I'm not mistaken.
Is it on or?
Turn it on.
Yep.
Test.
There we go.
Yes. All right.
All right, we're locked and loaded.
Do I hold this or do I?
I'll start, and then I'll
Okay.
quite literally pass the mic. All right, let's make this a historical reality.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming out. And thank you, as always, to Calero. An unbelievably awesome place to get together, to talk about craft and everything, but you can't do these things without a nice venue to be at. So it's always a pleasure to collaborate with Calero. We're trying to build something here. It's one event, one sip at a time, and Ann Bosford has just been an absolute supporter of the arts and our mission, so I look forward to just continuing to build this. So I've been looking forward to this. And I was just saying before we came on, today presents a unique opportunity for me because this is not my first rodeo with our featured author. So as the MC, it presents a challenge because I'm so familiar and I'm completely at ease, but I want to properly celebrate and do justice to this man's biography, his body of work. So we're going to really do a deep dive into the whole thing, the man behind the myth. But I think it's always good to start out on the formal side. So let me say a few words, and then we'll pass the mic and hear from our author. But suffice it to say, it's a genuine pleasure to be in conversation with David. As always, he's been a part of the 1455 community pretty much from the get-go. We've done events together online. You come out to events. We've partnered. We've done stuff. So I'm glad that we can continue doing that. And I know and respect him. And here's what I've written down because I don't want to botch it. On the other hand, I want to make sure I do him justice. In short, he's the antithesis of what we so often find from even the most accomplished authors and academics, individuals who are exceedingly good at one thing, so narrowly focused that they simply won't or can't allow too much outside experience to color their creative reflections. This gentleman, on the other hand, is very much a writer worth reading and engaging with, but quite simply, he's so much more. I find this both refreshing and inspiring. So let me read the official bio so we know who we're dealing with here. W.D. Hubbard is the author of Mobius, Meditations on Home, and his poems and essays have appeared in Button Poetry, The Good Men Project, and various literary journals. Born and raised in New Jersey, he now lives in Virginia and works in aviation. And you can check him out at WayneDavidHubbard.com. David, thank you for being here, and we are here to talk about, hear about, and celebrate Death Throes of the Broken Clockwork Universe. It's only May, and I'm putting my marker down and saying this is the coolest title of any book we're going to talk about this year. So already, mission accomplished. You have me at hello. Thanks for being here. Congratulations on this book. And since I've read the official bio, I would love you to talk a little bit about what I'm referring to when I say, who is this guy? And when I say that he's multifaceted, I didn't want to read the longer bio because I wanted you to talk a little bit about what you're bringing to the table as a human being. So, introduce yourself.
Well, thank you, Sean, and thank you very much for the afternoon and the occasion to share the written word, of course, with you, and thank you to Calero as well for the opportunity. Where do we begin? So, yes, aviation, poetry, literature, those have been driving forces in my life since I was a teenager, but also through the years, I have taken on other roles and responsibilities, and they've all kind of blended together. I can talk about how that comes together in my work as well. But beyond that, I'm also a nonprofit founder and the president of our local chess club, which is more of a chess organization moving through the Shenandoah Valley. And beyond that, I have taken on several roles in nonprofit leadership, which is another passion of mine, both in the Winchester community, working with the local children's museum, and also helping to stand up a national youth aviation nonprofit that's active across the United States and Europe, and so on and so forth. So I'm sure there's more that we'll dig into. Also, if we were to give the biography literally, that's grew up in New Jersey, right outside of Newark. Not to be stereotypical, but if you've ever seen The Sopranos, that was my hometown, and all those guys were my friends' uncles. But beyond that, quite a bit of culture growing up outside of New York City. You may have heard of Daughter by Nature, Queen Latifah, Whitney Houston. They were all from my city. And beyond that, I left home to join the Marine Corps at the age of 18, lived in Japan, Hiroshima, right outside of Hiroshima, an air base called Iwakuni, and then also California, and did a deployment in Iraq in 2004. Elements of that are also woven into my writings throughout the years. Left the military and then pursued a career in aviation, so I went to school at a aviation college called Vaughn, right outside of in New York City, Queens, across the street from LaGuardia Airport. And in 2008 was hired by my employer, the FAA, and that brought me to Virginia, where I had been in the Shenandoah Valley for 15 years. So beyond that, I move around a lot, do a lot of travel. I'm excited to talk about some of those events and how that's going to get into some of the new work that I plan to publish here shortly.
Awesome. So that's where I was going. I think in my capacity, talking with writers and storytellers all the time, of course, every life is complex and everyone brings myriad experience and perspective to their work, but I do think the work usually tells you when you have an individual that's narrowly focused on a particular passion or obsession, and then when you find an individual that's so erudite and so experienced and has looked outward in many senses of the word, it can't help but infuse the work. So there's a richness and a depth, and we talked about it before we came live, this interdisciplinary notion of how does one talk about space and war and home and love, and can that be done in poetry? And the answer from this book is unequivocally yes. So I definitely would love to hear some poems. I don't know if you want to read as we go, which is welcome, or if you want to read a few selections right up front, or how you want to. I got a lot of questions, but we need to hear. I think the best way to talk about this book is to hear some of the poems, and then we can talk a little bit about whatever poems you read and where you were at when you wrote those. I mean, I've got a million questions, but let's put the work first, if that works for you.
That sounds great.
Okay.
Yeah, I like that approach. So the new book, Throes of the Broken Clockwork Universe, was published in the fall of last year. And the collection is broken into two parts. The first part I call the time studies, and they are reflections of place inspired by interactions and encounters in my travels, both near and far. And the second half are called the love studies, which I take the risk to write love poetry, which, I mean, if there's any domain that has nothing but fantastic, if not immortal work, one is taking a big risk when you try to write love. But I took some interesting approaches, and all of this is bound in the context of the universe. Along the way of reading poetry, I also spent a lot of time reading astronomy, astrophysics, quantum mechanics. Why? I don't think that was intentionally planned, but as I was sitting over the years in the dark, writing my thoughts, I found these themes coming together. And it wasn't until later on that I started to connect the dots and seeing this theme of the stars and the planets and what that means as far as our understanding of self in this universe that we are constantly learning more and more about every day. So I'll read the first couple of poems, and I'll also talk about some of the latent context in between, because as I've gone around talking about these poems in recent interviews, there's a lot embedded here that needs to be teased out. The first poem of the collection is called Night Watch. Was it you who told me the capitals of the world are burning? I waited for you until it was clear that you would not come. How bright was our pleasure? How quickly we faded. Yet in and in we were perpetual. The blindness of dawn, the road at our feet. Now that our assassins have fallen asleep. Poets are constantly in conversation with other poets, I've learned, partly because we spend a lot of time alone. And two poets that I realized years after writing this, having a conversation with, is Li Cheng Li, who is a Chinese poet, and a poem that he published maybe about 5 years ago is called Changing Places in the Fire. It's a long poem, but the image of the capitals of the world burning immediately arrested me. And lo and behold, during the global pandemic, that was one image that came readily to mind. The final stanza about our assassins falling asleep is perhaps a nod to Terence Hayes, who wrote American Sonnets to My Past and Future Assassins, an African-American poet, and also in context of the social unrest and turmoil of 2020. That image in itself took on, yet again, new meaning. The second poem that I'll read is called Matrices. And I'll read it twice, because there's a lot of elements in here. Matrices. I dreamt you returned all of my letters. That night, a moon slid so close to the horizon, I thought we might walk across it. An array is an ordered arrangement of elements, very unlike my memories of you. So few, I admit, I multiplied us. The next night, a dream unfolded in linear equations. But the numerals vanished when I tried to solve. All that remained were variables. At daybreak, one of us woke up whole. This poem is a love poem, and it tries to measure our proximity and distances from love, perhaps both in purpose and also in memory. But it's embedded in a dream. The images of this poem are quite interesting. For example, the image of a moon sliding across the horizon is an actual event that happened to me driving through the Shenandoah Valley during October time, and it literally felt like the moon was the size of my windshield, and it was just completely unforgettable. The context of the matrices came from my explorations in linear algebra, because before the pandemic I was studying for a systems engineering fellowship at the University of Virginia. That was my goal, and I was working intently toward that and getting support. And then, as everyone knows, the world shut down. So I had all this great math in my head and really nothing to do with it. But the dream itself of trying to solve an equation and having numerals vanish was real. It was exactly what happened in a dream, and there was another image that was just so compelling. I wrote it in a notebook and just kind of sat there. So when it came to putting the poem together, not much of this was very conscious, and neither was the idea of addressing the subject of love and loss and everything in between. But somehow they all intersected and merged and actually came together, or at least I hope.
So, first of all, thank you. A couple of things I want to say. I think I already alluded to the fact that clearly there's a lot of intellectual engagement. One can at least appreciate things like math and physics and the universe. Not uncommon themes, but for a lot of the poetry I read that's grounded in a much more kind of navel gazing, which there's a place for that, but a little of that tends to go a long way in a very complex world. I want poetry that tries to engage with these complexities that intersect not only geographic space, but time and memories and dreams. One of the things I love about your work, and in this collection in particular, is that the aforementioned themes and multifaceted elements of engagement are compressed into these little diamonds. And I want to hear your thoughts about, is that just how you roll aesthetically, or is there a very purposeful effort to be as succinct as possible and kind of have these blasts of short insight that contain a lot? Because what that does is it almost obliges the reader to revisit, and then it's easier to read again if it's shorter, but there's a lot going on there, and I find it extremely effective to pack a lot of stuff into an economy of space.
That's a great question. And when one is trying to write, when I was trying to write, in fact, none of these poems, there was a long time I didn't realize that they were poems because I was in denial about being a poet, and that's a whole other story.
We'll get to that.
Oh, we'll have to get to that. So, I mean, I wrote because I had to, and for many years, especially coming out of Iraq, I couldn't speak, and being in public and all the other things that were on my mind, there was nowhere else for it to go. So I found that if I had to throw it anywhere, the poems, the paper could absorb it. And actually, interestingly, that's how the whole chess thing came about through it. It was the one thing that I can throw my full intellectual force at and then actually see positive benefits in return, and that changed the course of my life. With respect to the poems themselves, I found that I really do prefer short and also minimal. Some of my favorite music is minimalist music. Composers, Philip Glass is one of my heroes. I talk about him to my kids all the time. I don't know if anyone else listens to me. But the entire arc of his career, his body of work, the repetition in the beginning is mind-numbing. And then towards the end of his career, which we are now witnessing, in fact, I was just in New York City watching his Symphony number 13 at Carnegie Hall. You're looking at someone who's going to be remembered centuries from now.
That's right.
It's his work and his approach has been so influential for me. So I found through the course of writing many poems, listening to minimalist music like that, there's this going over it again and again and again, and trying to get clearer again and again and again. If there is any kind of image, and I'm not sure if I thought of this before or after the fact, but it's almost like taking a river and running it over a stone. It takes as long as it takes. So, for example, the collection here was written over a 10-year period, but individually, all I could see was that individual poem or that individual work or that image or now I acknowledge that's the process for me. That's the way it is, and that's the way it's going to be. So I'm just learning to trust it.
Yeah, well, I mean,
You have to, and I think that's another thing. Some writers come out fully formed from a very young age, and they've somehow cultivated. We think about, for instance, just off the top of my head, Fitzgerald or Hemingway, to name two heavyweights that seemingly kind of cultivated a style very young in their lives. But I think for most of us mere mortals, developing a style, developing a sensibility that kind of dictates the form and format is the result of a lot of reflection, a lot of writing badly in order to write well. I think we can all relate to, no matter where it ends up, it's usually pretty messy in the initial stages. And I guess I want to linger on and emphasize the fact that I believe, I don't think I have a priority in terms of what type of poems and length and style, but I do think it's more difficult or more challenging to compress a lot of things into a smaller space. I think the more indulgent writers go on too long because they're so infatuated with their own voice. What I get from this collection is a maximum of intensity and emotion, but a very cerebral engagement with form and almost a respect for the words themselves. Like, no more than is necessary. And I love the river over of the stone because there's just an awe of nature and how these things kind of come to us magically, but it also requires a lot of work to get the stuff done.
Yeah, it brings to mind one early lesson in both minimalist but quiet contemplation was living in Japan at the age of 19. So you take a kid out of northern New Jersey, run him through Paris Island, and at this point, I mean, you know what you got, right? You got a wise guy. And then send them on the other side of the world where I'm in a completely different culture, and the modus operandi is not going out and announcing who you are and what you're all about. It was just such a pivotal and influential moment in my life that even now I'm still catching up to. And so the culture, the time that I was there, it was during the World Cup, when the World Cup was in Japan and Korea, so we had people from all over the world. And these were my peers, these were my running mates that I spent one of the most fantastic years of my life learning how other people see the world and learning that there are other ways to be and other ways to approach life versus foot on the pedal, 110 miles an hour. Years later, I do struggle with that now because the reality of trying to be effective in our society in America does require go, right? Just don't stand there, go. But one of the things that I experiment with, and one of the things I do keep in mind, is when to pause and when to let things unfold in a way that is very intentional. And there are times when I do feel that it is very, very instrumental in my way of solving problems and also writing. So, to that effect, I do have some haiku in here.
Yes, you do.
Another form that is highly, highly respected, and I'll only read a couple of them. But I did a small series of haiku. These were meditations on winter, and I'll just go into them. So I'll just pick a couple. Winter View B. Silver ice slivers. Winter's metallurgic night. Empyrean gem. Winter View C. Overwintered bud. Dreamtime Oscillations of Vernal Hunger, and so on and so forth. So yeah, short form is where it's at. That's where it turned into it for me. Other fun fact about writing poetry, I mentioned there was a lot of reluctance, but the second poem that I had ever submitted for publication was the winner of the Button Poetry Contest in 2020, and that was a very momentous occasion. When I got the email, I jumped up and down, I screamed, I ran around the place like a wild person. And for those of you who don't know, Button Poetry is a very, very highly respected poetry outlet, has 2 or 3 million followers on social media, and very active in, oh my goodness, putting out different voices and different sounds in American and world literature that have not been as heard as forcefully, and so now they are just tearing it up. So that was a very big moment.
Yeah.
But all that to say, short form is where it ended up. Once I got that, I was like, okay, the universe is like, okay, this is the path, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So
That's a great segue into, you know, the larger notion of craft. You talked about, you know, your post-Iraq experience, and the words weren't either there or you didn't want to share or weren't ready. So I'm curious about writing as an outlet, because you alluded to it beautifully, but I'd like to hear a little more about how that, you know, obviously not a straight line between starting to really write seriously and ending up writing haiku. But I'm also curious, because I don't know if I've puzzled this out from your biography. How far back does writing, have you always written and you got more serious about it later in life, or was this really something that you turned to a bit later? Because most writers will say, oh, right when I could read, I started to write little stories. So talk a little bit about when you started writing, and how it went from not shorter form to shorter form in poetry, but also what that process has done for you, having had life and intellectual experiences that maybe don't usually result in poetry. So there's a fascinating kind of insight into your mind there too.
Yeah, thank you. Boy, this is a question that could easily last an hour. In fact, one of the things that I've been writing on and off for years is a memoir, which some have said that that's my magnus opus, but at some point that will all come together. The origin story, if there was one, well, definitely reading was always a huge part of my upbringing. I was raised very religious, and so that limited the canon of things that I could read until I was an adult and got a library card and kind of went wild. But also the expression of ideas wasn't something that was free-flowing in so much as how I would encourage it today, especially for my kids and some of the kids that I helped mentor. However, I was always a big letter writer, even in high school. No one writes letters anymore. I mean, everything's text message. We can get to the impact of what that's going to have on future biographies one day, because I'm very curious on that, where all this great information is being stored.
right.
But beyond that, my friends enjoyed it. It was kind of a hit. It was one of those things that when I went to the Marine Corps, after my amazing time in Japan, the Corps sent me to 29 Palms, California, which is in the middle of the Mojave Desert. And I felt like that was punishment for all the great time that I had. But again, a huge shift in time and culture and everything. Now I'm going from the epicenter of this international city to the desert, where you can see anywhere in any direction as long as you can see. And so I had a lot of time on my hands, and then I began to just write, because I still had a lot of things churning inside of me that I questioned about. Of course, 9/11 had occurred, and again, another conversation as far as an hour and the impact on that growing up right outside of New York.
Sure.
But when I went to Iraq, I had a marble notebook, in my rucksack along with all my gear. And in those long hours out in the Al-Anbar province, I was stationed in many places across Iraq, but I spent a lot of time on this little road. You go west from Baghdad, there's a fort, one goes to Syria, the other one goes to Jordan. Someone said, hey, let's put a base there. And that's where I was without electricity and running water for months on end in 120-degree heat. And that was a really great time to start reflecting on life and what's going on in the world and how do we get here. And so a few other things happened. Someone sent a care package, and in that care package were a few books. One was on the history of the Middle East, as far as Iraq in the 20th century was concerned. Quite eye-opening. Another book was Gates of Fire by Stephen Pressfield about the 300 Spartans who guarded Thermopylae. Amazing book. And the third one was For Whom the Bell Tolls by Ernest Hemingway. And certainly Hemingway, who I didn't really know him from anyone else because, again, I didn't have the traditional English high school experience. The way that he talked about war and then being in the middle of the war was just an eye-opener. I didn't have any interest in fiction. I didn't know that you can tell these stories and be so accurate and be so human in the midst of the most inhumane experience that a person can go through. And so that stuck with me. When I got home and when I got out, I found myself getting back into the library because I still had a ton of questions. And I actually thought I was going to get to the bottom of the history of the Middle East. I actually tried. I read, I found Gilgamesh, and I embarked on what may have been like a second or a third education, just reading and absorbing American literature, and then writing my own thoughts along the way, trying to make sense of everything. I didn't make sense of the Middle East. As close as I was able to get was that it goes on forever. And what we had attempted to do in Iraq was the continuation of a civilizational story that goes back to Alexander the Great and perhaps even back further. Because there were very clear patterns and elements in how we got into the picture that had been repeated extensively. And so at that point, I just said, okay, I'm done. But there were still a few more things that had to happen for me to understand and make the leap as to my place in all of it. And over time, I did find a narrowing around literature, around poetry specifically. And one thing led to another, as they said, as I tried to make sense. I think that was the only way that I could keep moving physically was to keep moving my pen. And eventually, I think someone looked over my shoulder and said, hey, you have some really good stuff here, right? And that actually made things worse. That actually made things worse because then I started to get self-conscious about it. And I wanted to, like, I don't know, be Hemingway or something, you know? It just kind of got away from the core of the story itself. But to be continued, it's a story that I'm still trying to figure out.
Yeah. So 2 questions from that, and I'll tee it up so as to not hopefully be either very opaque or loaded question. I'll just briefly speak from personal experience. I've written a lot of nonfiction, I've written a lot of fiction, but in the last half decade or so, I've written a lot more poetry. And one reason for that is, in as non-pretentious way as possible, you do have to follow the muse and whatever you're feeling. But for me, having written so much nonfiction and a lot of criticism, I found that poetry was a form that I could do things I couldn't do in the other forms. So I'm curious if you've had a similar experience as you've been more laser focused on poetry as a form. And then I know about the memoir Work in Progress, and I'm very excited to see where that goes. I'm also just genuinely curious, will some war recollections, and of course there are some, but that some of these experiences that are in the memoir, might poetry eventually be a form where you explore some of those thoughts?
Yeah, the memoir was the point of everything. I was not interested in being a poet. I did not understand that it was acceptable to be a poet. I hate being a poet. I tried to. The day that I was busted, I was taking books of poetry out of the library and sticking them underneath books about astronomy and like gardening and everything else. And there was a particular book by Octavia Paz called The Double Flame that had this cover with these cherubim on them that looked very romantic. And so I slid that right underneath my pile. Well, when I went to go check out the books, the librarian took Octavia Paz, put a red on the top, and I knew that I was had, right? So like I knew I couldn't hide it anymore. I have definitely found that poetry is the right form for communicating some of these moments that are colossal, like in Iraq, like 9/11, like other things that we do experience, in our lives, both good and bad. And it was a surprise to me to find that it can communicate that much content and meaning and depth in such a small space. So I'm fascinated by that, and I do think that's something that I will continue to experiment with as I continue to grow as a writer.
You just keep talking about the Middle East, war, history, and our mutual kind of conversation about what poetry can do. A lot of examples spring to mind, but you're making me think about a real formative experience when I was in college. The first time I read Shelley's Ozymandias. And speaking of, because you put it really beautifully earlier, in a way that I haven't really fully, I think, fully grasped theoretically this notion of Middle Eastern history is like, that goes back as long as we go back to an extent. So, we need to be very humble about how long of a time that is. But for me, having read fiction about war, having read tons of nonfiction, a poem like Ozymandias that somehow captures power and politics and the passage of time and what endures, there it is right there. Just to take one example of what can a poem do that 300 pages on that same topic would somehow just not be, it would be too much and not enough.
Right.
And a one-page poem that nails it, to me, I think that's the kind of the white whale that we're all chasing. Like, how do we capture these moments or these deep thoughts in a way that would transcend language, transcend politics, and just nail some deep truths?
Yeah, totally. The other part of this book, again, as I started, was around astronomy, right, and the stars. So how did I make the leap from those type of ideas to poems including Orion and all these other fascinating otherworldly objects? As I was starting to re-educate myself on the history of time, recognizing that the world did not begin in 1982 when I was born, and a lot of things happened long before I arrived and stepped foot in the Middle East. Astronomy was a safe haven for me, and I read through the biography of Albert Einstein. Oh my goodness, if we did nothing but talk about him in one sitting, that would be more than enough. But the title Throes of the Broken Clockwork Universe was an homage to that moment when space-time does collapse, when your assumptions about life, how the world works, is upended again and then again and again and again. And so the question that I had for myself as I was reading this was, a broken clockwork universe, what does that look like? And I actually tried to imagine it. What does it sound like? Around 2016, the whole gravitational wave scene was going on, and I lost my mind when that discovery happened. That was like a eureka running down the street moment for me, literally. And then I asked myself, well, what does that feel like? And then I said, oh, I know what that feels like. And then I knew that that was going to be the title for this book and this book of poems. The Haven of the Stars, and of course, poets have been writing about the stars since, again, time immemorial, forever, and making the connection between our place in the cosmos, but also the meaning of life and love. And so I always found this relief in imagining these otherworldly objects. And there was a specific time when I did visit a national observatory called Kitt Peak in Tucson, Arizona, taking a night tour for the first time and looking through these state-of-the-art telescopes at these objects and having the most incredible time seeing nebulas and planets and rings and moons and you name it, with the physical eye, not off of a screen, just a totally different moving experience. And the astronomer, who clearly loved what he did for a living, said that as amazing as these otherworldly objects are, they are not aware of their own existence. And this is what makes being a human being exceptional. And again, my brain just changed, right? Like the Earth is moving through the cosmos at 65,000 miles per hour, and that was one of the moments I felt it, right? And so, as I moved through some of the other poems in the collection, that was also what I was grappling with and making sense of. So with that, I'll read a few of the love poems, and the second part of the book is called The Love Studies. And in the Love Studies are a series of poems called the arias, A-R-I-A. Like an opera singer singing the beautiful solo, and they're all very short. And in the collection is 1 through 11. I'm now up to 15, and I'll probably be writing these probably till the day that I die. But I think they get at the heart of what I was really trying to achieve and answer, and I will continue to as I go on. So I'll just read through a few of these. Aria, number 1. What I did is not what I wanted to do. It was as simple as this. I wished to love you. So I built a thing for the world to see and inscribed your name eternally. Aria, number 2. We erected worlds with our words. We made our moment immortal and rich. What would it matter if you knew my name? I see you. Aria, number 4. You dream life into truth. Imagine me, electric, in universe, parallel. For you, my equal, appearing and new. I hold in my attitude the favor of nations. I consume dark matter and roar stars.
So when we started out, I alluded to the fact that this gentleman contains multitudes, and I'm so grateful that we've had the opportunity to hear in your voice, your words that convey what all the best introduction in the world couldn't summarize. It's this richness, and we've been in space, we've been inside the heart, and everywhere in between. It's really powerful stuff. And that's why these events are important, right? To read about a writer or read the writer's work, that's what most of us have to do all the time. But when we have the opportunity to be in person and hear the author reading their work, there's something very magical about that. I'm really humbled by it. Are there questions from the audience? I want to make sure that those that came out today are heard. If there's any comments or questions or things that they would like this very smart gentleman to speak about. I mean, I know we left it all on the field. There's not really anything left, but I do want to make sure we address any potential questions.
Did you have something?
Oh, I would just go out and read a couple more poems if that works.
Twist my arm, absolutely.
But yeah, Love Poem for Sappho definitely is one that I would love to talk about. This was the winner of the Bud Poetry contest. It was a poem that was written in the middle of the night and sat there because I was sure that I was going crazy when this came across the wire. And then sat there for many years until 2020, when this was one of the rare moments where it felt like the poem had met the moment. And so I'll just go into it. Love Poem for Sappho. When they ask what it was like, we will say, we lived in a lighthouse with 19 million windows and danced for the sea without a face. The gods will never believe we fooled them into venerating us. This poem is in fact a love poem for Sappho, a poet who I eminently adore. And she has an immortal line when she says, I tell you in another lifetime, someone will remember us. And so in the middle of the night I was contemplating that, and I asked myself, if there was something that I could say to the poet Sappho, what would it be? If I could communicate something, and I just went for it. And something in there connected. It was just one of those moments. So in alignment with the arias and the other poems in the love studies, Sappho is one of the few faces that appear, but I also constructed the other poems not necessarily thinking of a person, male or female. I was trying to get at something deeper than that. In arias number 4, there's some nods to Walt Whitman that you might have recognized there, kind of in the way that he might, oh my goodness, that beautiful bard, go through the streets just celebrating, celebrating the people that he sees and looking at a beauty that you really can't convey visually, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think you really just teed up another observation, which is, it's its own challenge and for the reader a reward when someone's able to fuse kind of their intelligence and their passion with a style. But I think you just hit something that has been bubbling around my consciousness as I've spent time with your work. And it's, any writer can be super intelligent, any writer can be super passionate and full of ability. I think ultimately it is that love of life, that love of experience, that love of people, the love of learning, that gives poetry that lasts its soul. I think your work has that in spades.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. It's nice to hear that. The poems that I've written, I intentionally wrote them in plain language. There are some other words that I have that are very complex and complicated, but I wanted these poems to be accessible, even at the risk of being obvious. However, what I found what I could do with these images is embed them with these deeper meanings and deeper connections to these other forces of time and history, and then even at certain junctures make them work against themselves. So although the poems go down smooth, that's an actual review that I got once. It's intentional.
Yeah.
And so I am happy to hear that there are even people who don't consider themselves poetry readers picking it up and connecting with it, because that's the whole point.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that is the lack of pretentiousness. I think it's an immature writer that thinks they need to dazzle, that needs to use fancy words, that can't state things plainly. I think big feelings require plain spoken observation, and doing that in a beautiful way. And it's a lot harder than it sounds, as many of us have found. The last question I have, and we talked about it a little bit before we came live, and I think it warrants mentioning because I'd love you to talk a little bit about your experience. We were talking about how in 2023, and it's certainly the last decade or so, I think it's been this way, we harken back, and I don't think the world was ever that simple, but certainly in the 20th century, someone could be a writer. That worked where someone would write a book and it would go out and there was a team behind that would market it and sell it and set up readings and do those kind of things. First of all, that world just doesn't exist anymore. That's kind of a given. But what we were talking about was this notion of leaning into the times that you live in and how no writer now can afford to be aloof to the fact that no one is going to be as keen to market and sell and find readers as the writer. So now a writer really has to wear a lot of hats. And you wear a lot of hats professionally and personally anyway, and then you add writing to that. But I like having watched how you have cultivated your own brand and have really leaned into, I have to meet a potential readership halfway. The work will be discovered if I make it discoverable. So I don't know if there's a question in there so much as wanting to compliment you for your work is finding a readership because it's worthy of that, and you have books in the world. But we've never been busier, and yet we have to be even busier as writers to have half a shot. How do you find yourself navigating that, and what have you learned?
Wow, if I had a choice, I would probably lock myself in a room and do nothing but writing.
Yeah.
I mean, that is my anchor. That's what brings it all together for me. And so I don't watch a lot of TV. I don't have time. There's so much good content out there too. It's a shame. But yeah, writing is what brings it all together to me in all these different domains, all these different disciplines that I'm working in, whether it be a professional, be it in the community, or be it those things, those questions that are nagging at me. The key really speaks to diversity. Was one big word that has been top of mind for me for many reasons. And so often, at least in America, diversity, we just default at ethnic or socioeconomic diversity. And the word diversity and the concept is so much broader. It encompasses all aspects if we're talking about a single human being, of our past, present, our ancestors. The things that stand out to us, the ideas that are communicated to us, how we access them, how we use them, how we discard them. And so when I hear the word diversity, I think everything's at play. Like there is nothing that is available to me that I cannot use, leverage, or create something meaningful from. And what makes it a little bit different than just dabbling, I am also looking to immerse myself in these different ways of thinking. And even if I'm getting too comfortable, I will try to do something to disrupt my own, now is that a good or smart or sane way to live is probably another way, but there's so much value in taking these ideas that on the surface seem diverse and hurtling at each other as quickly as you can to see what is produced. Also top of mind is the Large Hadron Collider. I was in Geneva in March and had a chance to visit the site. Didn't have a chance to visit the collider itself because it's very popular and a lot of people want to see it. But in regards to science, in regards of international minds coming together to work on this problem of what is the universe actually made of, what is that other 85 to 90% that surrounds us that we can't see, taste, or feel. That in and of itself was just so huge for me, and in a way a vindication of this kind of model that I'm exploring, of bringing these different ideas together and trying to test them, see what makes sense, and then leaving something perhaps of meaning for others in that pursuit. So I definitely have a lot more writing to do. I'm going to be busy for a while, but I look forward to see what else comes next.
Well, I think we all do. I know I do. And, a lot of your answers today really could be taken apart and represent the whole. But I think you just gave as good a definition of the writing impulse, the desire to connect, and what makes a creative tick, which is that insatiable curiosity, setting challenges for oneself, and doing the work and enjoying it. So that is both very enlightening and it's incredibly inspiring. So as always, I'm tremendously grateful to have the opportunity to chat with you. You're talking about your work makes me want to revisit what I've already read, and makes me really excited for what's to come. So I'm delighted that we were here today to be able to celebrate this collection. Again, the title is such a knockout. Death Throes of the Broken Clockwork Universe. Thank you, my friend. Thank you again to Calero. We will be back. Thank you, sir, and we look forward to what's to come.
Thank you very much, Sean, and I look forward to more discussions like this. We're just getting started. Thank you, Calero, and thank you for being here today. I really appreciate the opportunity.
All right. Thank you. Excellent. Woo!
It's a lot in there.
I'm sorry about that block.
Oh, it's all good.
It's like, why is it bothering to just pick up?
It's natural. He's just doing the
You
fly
get
dance.
to